thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight on thank you. For coming out on a very fine meteorological summer evening. And I qualify that because it's still spring. Sorry, I'm trying to get my microphone in my pocket. And special thanks too to the Wheaton Historic Commission who suggested this topic several months ago.
A little closer.
A little closer? Tell you what, how's that?
Okay.
Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. Who suggested this topic several months ago, and Joyce and I kind of wondered too, is anybody going to show up for this? But I think now we understand the passion that a lot of folks have for the CA&E Railway and railways in general in the area. So we want to thank the Wheaton Historic Commission for setting this up. We also want to thank the Wheaton Public Library for providing this venue, this very nice venue for us to give this presentation. And the City of Wheaton for recording it. And eventually it'll go up on YouTube, I think.
The city's page and the library's
Right.
YouTube.
Okay. Another housekeeping bit before we get started. Just wanted to mention that the Wheaton Historic Commission has been working on getting a plaque installed for the CA&E Railway by the old station by Liberty and Maine. So that's something to look forward to in the next few months. That's going to be dictated, the schedule will be dictated by the city, but look for that in your local newspapers, et cetera, or online, because that should be coming, and it's long overdue in our humble opinion. Another thing just to mention real quick is the fact that this is a big topic, I think as many of you know. We could easily spend 3 or 4 hours talking about the history of the CA&E, but we've got about an hour. We'll probably run a little long. So we're going to run through material fairly quickly. And if you've got a question or comment, we just ask if you could hold it to the end. We are going to do a Q&A and a discussion at the end of this. If we make a grievous mistake, feel free to point that out to us in real time. But in general, if you could hold your questions and comments till the end, that would be much appreciated. And we can get through all of the material at that point. So with that in mind, why don't we get started? So what is the CA&E? I think as all of you know, it's the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railway. Initially, it was the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railway, and it changed its names for reasons which we'll talk about later. But it was also known as the Aurora and Elgin, which was a play on the name the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railway. It was also known as the Great Third Rail. And why was it known as the Great Third Rail? Because it was electric. Not only was it electric, but it was fast, and they designed it for speed. And one of the reasons or ways that they achieved that speed was via the third rail. They could have used overhead trolley wires, but that would not have been a particularly fast railway. And they wanted a fast railway to be competitive with the steam engine railways that already existed. Also, in addition to electric, being an electric railway, was the Wheaton roots. I mean, it has deep Wheaton roots here in Wheaton, Illinois. The headquarters, the administrative center for the CA&E was here, starting out and then ending up. It left for a while, but all is forgiven. It went to Aurora for a few years, but for the most part it was here in Wheaton, Illinois. The hub for this railway was also right here in Wheaton. It was a spoke and wheel design. There were 3 major spokes heading out to Aurora, Elgin, and into Chicago. And the hub was right here in Wheaton, and there was a very nice station at Liberty and Maine that served the station and has been long gone for quite some time. Thirdly, there was a very large rail yard that dominated the southeast portion of the city, over 20 acres south of Liberty Drive to the west of West Avenue, where there was a rail yard, there was maintenance, huge maintenance sheds, storage facilities, a dispatcher's tower, et cetera. So the entire southeast portion of the city was dominated by this rail yard. So the operations of this rail yard was all in Wheaton here. So that's one of the reasons why we think that this railway is very important to DuPage County, to King County, and Cook County, but also to the city of Wheaton itself. What were the origins of the CA&E? Well, there was basically 4 things that converged over time. First was the Fox Valley Trolley System, which began in the 1870s as a horse-drawn affair. The first one was in Elgin by the watch factory on National Street. And it was a horse-drawn trolley that would deliver employees to and from work. A few years later in Aurora, they also installed a horse-drawn trolley. It was about 5 miles in length. It went out to Stolp Island in the middle of the city. And by 1890, it was electrified. They had gone from horse-drawn manual pulling of the trolley to electrification, and they were amongst the first to go to electrification. It was about this time in the 1890s when some Cleveland capitalists, there was a couple of factions in Cleveland that dominated the railway industry in Cleveland, Ohio, took notice of the Fox Valley system as well as the Chicago system. And they had already built some rather extensive electric interurban trains in the Cleveland area. Cleveland was the Silicon Valley of its time. It was the nexus of the steel industry and the railway industry. They had some good universities feeding for engineers coming out of Great Western Reserve, et cetera, that were being the civil engineers for the railway that was being put together in Cleveland. They began to eyeball other venues in the Midwest, including Detroit and Illinois, and they had their eyes on Illinois for a few reasons. One was the booming population in Chicago and along the Fox River Valley with Elgin and Aurora. The second was Illinois is flat. It's, I think, the second flattest state in the nation. Flatness means there's few grade changes, means it's cheaper to install, cheaper to operate. So that was a very attractive feature to them. The other thing about it was flatland means they could build a fast railway. And that's what they aimed to do, build a very fast electric railway in Illinois. Of course, the fourth thing was electricity. Electricity had been around, at least in theory, since the 1830s. Some of the earliest electric motors were built, but they really didn't come into practical usage until the 1880s. And one of the early adopters of this technology were the trolley systems for moving people. So the first electric trolleys were in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and the Fox Valley system was amongst the first that adopted this. And the thing to be said is that the electric interurban trains were the dot-coms of their day. They were exploding all across the Midwest and to the east. And I think this map illustrates this point. This is from 1911, and this shows all of the electric interurban train systems that were in place in the Chicago area. From Chicago, you could head up to Milwaukee, south to Kankakee. You could go around the lake to Grand Haven, east to South Bend, and even further south. You could head southwest to Joliet, all the way to Princeton, Illinois. You could go to DeKalb. You could go to Belvedere, Rockford, Janesville, Beloit, et cetera. So it was an extensive and expansive network of interurban trains that existed in the early part of the 20th century. And the interesting thing is I think they're all gone now. But it was a boom period for building these interurban trains. So who was the competition? Well, I think as many of you know, I think there's a lot of rail fans in the audience, I'm just guessing. I think as many of you know that there was a lot of steam engine trains already in the Chicago area and had been here for quite some time. There was the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul that went through Elgin. There was the Illinois Central that went through Coleman, just to the south of Elgin. Chicago Great Western, of course, went through St. Charles. The Chicago Northwestern went through Geneva, and the Chicago Burlington and Quincy went through Aurora. And what do they have in common? They were all steam powered. And I think the Cleveland capitalists saw an opportunity here. So this is just a 1903 map showing the extent of the railroad networks within Chicago that were serving the Fox Valley area and coming out from Chicago. We just talked about the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, Elgin, the Illinois Central, Chicago Great Western, the Chicago Northwestern, and the Chicago Burlington and Quincy Railroad. So it was well served already. The Fox Valley and Chicago area were well served by railroads. So why did they think they had a competitive advantage with electric? There are several reasons. One is that it was clean. Steam engines burned coal ash, soot. So they were somewhat dirty affairs. All along the rail lines at the stations and so on, there was a lot of soot and ash. And the electric trains were going to be much cleaner as a result. Now, you could argue that there was still pollution, but it was isolated to where the powerhouse was in Batavia. But it wasn't distributed all throughout the stations and so on. So it was clean. It was also fast. They were going to build a very fast electric train here in Illinois. And that was one of the big competitive advantages that they were going to have. The steam-powered trains traveled 30, 40 miles an hour. They could travel faster, but typically they didn't. And they aimed to build a train that could go 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. And in fact, they designed it to go over 100 miles an hour. They never achieved that in practice, but they did achieve going 60 to 70 miles an hour in practice. It was modular. One of the things that I learned and that I was fascinated by was the fact that all of the passenger cars had their own electric motor, which meant that as trains came out from Chicago to the Wheaton hub, 2 of them could peel off and go to Elgin, 3 could go to Aurora, and vice versa. In the morning, two-car train from Aurora could come up to Wheaton, and a 3-car train from Elgin could come to Wheaton. They could couple together and head into Chicago. So this gave them great flexibility. This modularity gave them great flexibility in scheduling trains, not jockeying locomotives and so on. And they felt that there was an operational efficiency in this, as well as the operational efficiency in how to manage power distribution, getting coal to various locations in the railway. They didn't have to worry about that. They just had to get the coal to Batavia, to the powerhouse, which we'll talk about. Finally, electricity was the latest technology. You know, the analogy we would have today, it's sort of like pre-internet and post-internet, I think, in many of our lifetimes. Or now, today, it's, 5G wireless, artificial intelligence. You often see things advertised, it's using artificial intelligence. I'm not sure most people know what that means, and I'm not sure the writer of those stories even knows what that means, but gee, it's using artificial intelligence, it's gotta be good. So electricity was the same way at this time. We were going from the steam age and manual power to electricity. And when you stop and think about what a dramatic change that must have been in people's lives. So the idea of using electricity was very intriguing to most people. So those Cleveland capitalists, there were 2 factions. There was Everett and Moore and Pomeroy and Mandelbaum, and they were competitors in Cleveland. And they had the number 1 and number 2 spot in the electric railways in the Cleveland area. And initially, they were working against each other. They were competing. They were both going after the same market here in Illinois. And they started buying up licenses for railways to the west of Chicago, and they started buying up bits and pieces of the Fox Valley trolley system. And they realized around 1899 that they were stepping on each other's toes and they better work together or neither of them were going to build anything. So they formed the Aurora, Wheaton, and Chicago Railroad, which was formally incorporated in 1899. And that was the genesis of the A&C and the CA&E. The right-of-way was purchased in 1900 and they started the grading. And this was a big deal. You start planning out the route, buying the right-of-way. And they bought it in 100-foot wide and 66-foot wide right-of-ways. And the intention all along was to build a dual trackway on all of the branches. They ended up building a dual trackway from Wheaton to Chicago, but they only built a single trackway to Aurora and Elgin. But their intention all along was to build a dual trackway, and they bought sufficient right-of-way to allow them to expand into that. In 1901, they finally got the license to operate a railway in Elgin. And so they changed the name now that they had the 2 major population centers on the Fox River Valley. That was great, so they changed the name to the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railroad, which was the official name for about 20 years. In 1902, they began laying the track all through the previously graded route. On May 17th, they fired up the boiler in Batavia. The boilers generated the steam, which powered the generators, which generated the alternating current, which powered the trains. So they powered up the powerhouse in Batavia. A few months later, in August, they officially opened service from 52nd Street in Chicago to Aurora. 52nd Street is by Laramie, where Laramie is today. So it was not all the way into downtown Chicago at this point. They're sort of on the outer outskirts of Chicago. A month later, they opened the Batavia Spur. So at this point, we've got a route that goes from Chicago to Aurora, and they've got the Batavia Spur, which went off to the powerhouse in downtown Batavia. Several months later, in May of 1903, the Elgin Branch opened up. So it was over several months that the AE&C actually opened up. This is a very nice photograph from circa 1901, 1902, but it shows the laying of the tracks, the building of the bridge. This is a short distance to the west of the Prince Crossing Station, the Ingleton Station, as it was known then. And this is the Chicago Great Western Crossing. And a few interesting things about this photograph from my vantage point is, notice the ridges they had to build. They had to do some massive earthworks, either in cuts or ridges. When you walk through Lincoln Marsh and you see that the ridge you're walking on, that was built by the railway. That ridge wasn't there before. When you walk up the Jewel Road, there's a cut that takes you up the Jewel Road. That wasn't there before. So all these cuts and ridges were put in there by the AE&C Railway at that time. And they had to move massive amounts of dirt and earth to create the runway for the bridges that spanned this particular crossing. The other thing to notice is it's a wooden bridge. Many of the bridges were either concrete or wood when they first built the railway. It wasn't until 5 to 10 years later that many of the wood bridges were converted to steel truss bridges. So for example, the Volunteer Bridge, it was known as Tall Bridge back in the day, and that was initially built of wood, and it was converted to steel truss bridge in the 1907, 1909 timeframe. So let's talk a little bit about the design. So the initial railway design was 3 branches and a spur. It was a wheel and spoke design, as I mentioned. The designer was a man by the name of Charles J. Jones. And he was one of the few members of management of the Cleveland syndicate that actually moved out to Chicago with his family. I think the chief engineer as well as the superintendent of the railway were the only 2 that moved out. The rest of the management stayed behind in Cleveland. I think Chicago was still out in the boondocks, and they didn't want to leave the sophisticated realms of Cleveland to come to Chicago. But a few did, and Charles J. Jones did. And I'm not going to go into any depth, but he and his family had a somewhat tragic end. So if you're interested in that, you can watch our video on that topic. He and his family are buried in the Wheaton Cemetery. But in any event, he designed a very good railroad. Wheaton was the hub. They had a main line going 18.5 miles into Chicago. It was a dual trackway. They had the Aurora branch was a single trackway going 14 miles between Wheaton and Aurora with a spur coming off of Eola Junction. Eola Junction you'll see shortly on the map, but it was a 6-mile spur that went off the Aurora branch, passed by the powerhouse, and went into downtown Batavia. There was also the Elgin Branch in 1903, as we mentioned. It was also a single trackway that was 16 miles. So all in all, they designed, engineered, and built 55 miles of trackway. So this was a very big railway at the time. And just to underscore the fact that they had to build dozens and dozens of bridges, culverts, underpasses, cuts and ridges to make this railway. Even though Illinois is very flat, it still went through multiple river valleys, the Des Plaines River Valley, the East Branch of the DuPage River, the West Branch of the DuPage River. Each of those river valleys had to be surmounted with bridges, cuts and ridges, and so on. So it was a huge engineering effort, and they accomplished it in the span of a few years. This is a map from 1902 showing the original layout. And a few things to notice here. You've got the dual trackway from Wheaton going into 52nd Avenue. You've got the single trackway coming here to Aurora with the Batavia Spur from Eola Junction, coming to the powerhouse and into downtown Batavia. The Elgin line is not in service yet, so this is just a statement that this is coming. You've got a little bit of a dual trackway here from Wheaton to the Chicago Golf Club. That was a fairly popular venue at the time, the country club. So trains would run quite frequently from Wheaton to the Chicago Golf Club. Oh, the other thing to note here too is there's very few stations in this original map. There's only a handful of stations at the major sites like Lombard, Glenelg, Elmhurst, et cetera. So that was going to change. And 2 years later, this is the same route, 1904, and there's 2 or 3 things to note here. One is that the Elgin Branch is now open. There's dozens of new stations that have been added along the way. This is very popular. The uptake on this was very big and very quick. People wanted to be involved, and a lot of new subdivisions sprung into existence all along here. And in the newspapers at the time, you see many advertisements for taking people out to Bellwood, to Ardmore, and so on, to buy property. And they would take the CA&E to visit these subdivisions and potentially to buy. The other thing to notice about this route map is now you see the linkage with the Fox Valley system. So you could go from Aurora to Elgin, and then Elgin down into Wheaton and so on, and make the loop and go all the way into Chicago. But not all the way to downtown Chicago at this point, 1904. You still could not go all the way there. So we've talked about the electric power, and where did that power come from? Well, we talked about the Batavia power plant. So they built a very large power plant in Batavia. And why did they do that? Why couldn't they go to Commonwealth Edison to buy the power? And the short answer is Commonwealth Edison didn't exist back then. There were no electric utilities in the area at that point. So they had to generate their own power. And they were up to the task. Again, you think about the engineering skill that went into this, not only building the railway, but electrifying it and generating the power, and being one of the first, if not the first, large-scale electric utility in the western suburbs. So when you think about the CA&E, you should think not only about the electric railway, but the fact that they were one of the first, if not the first, electric utility in the western suburbs. They helped us make that leap from manual and steam power to electric power. The electric power plant in Batavia was a brand new building that they built for this specific task. It was located in Glenwood, by Glenwood Park, which still exists in Batavia. And if you ever go in that area, you see the Funway amusement park, that's where the power plant was located. It's changed character quite a bit since, since then. Now there were 8 coal-fired boilers that generated the steam that powered the generators that generated the electricity. Starting out, they added 2 more boilers within a few years to amp up the, so to speak, to amp up the power. Water was taken from the Fox River, which was only a few hundred yards to the west. And it was taken from the Fox River via giant wooden pipes. They were about 3 feet in diameter or so. And those pipes are probably still buried under the ground, rotting away, but very large wooden pipes brought the water into the power station a few hundred yards away. This power plant generated 26,000 volts alternating current, 3-phase, 24 hertz. Today we use 60 hertz, so 24 hertz, it's oscillating, that's 24 cycles per second versus the 60 cycles per second we see today. So an electric light would flicker quite a bit if you hooked it up to 24 hertz power. That 26,000 volts of electricity was then shipped overland via it was 3-phase, so 3 wires, 3 very thick aluminum wires, went along the railways and sometimes overland to the Ingleton station, for instance. And it went to 6 substations. So there were 6 substations as part of the original electric design of this railway. 3 of those substations were, I call them basic design. 2 Two are still in existence, thankfully. The Clintonville substation, if you've ever visited that, it's in South Elgin. In my opinion, it's a must-see. Go stop by there sometime. The building is still in a very good state of preservation. The second one was at Ingleton, which is today Prince Crossing. Now, the station you see today doesn't look like the one that was built in 1902. It had two additions put on, probably in the 1910 to 1920 timeframe. But Ingleton was one of the first basic substations along with Clintonville. And then the third was at Hanks Avenue in Aurora, which has long since been torn down. There were three enhanced substations, one in Maywood, one in Lombard, and one in Warrenville. And the only difference between the enhanced version and the basic version were basically two things. One was there was an awning that stretched across the entire platform on the enhanced version versus only a part of the platform on the basic version. And secondly, it had a small waiting room appended onto one end of the building, a waiting room with toilets and a ticket agent. So there was very little difference between the basic and the enhanced models, but they did have a slight difference between them. The job of the substation was to do three things. First, to step down the 26,000 volts to 600 volts AC, and it did it via transformers. Those transformers generated a lot of heat. The second thing that it did was convert the 600 volts AC to 600 volts direct current, and they did that via what they called rotary converters, these giant machines taller than me that spun at several thousand revolutions per minute and generated a huge amount of noise as well as heat. Those would convert the power from AC to DC. And the third thing that the substations then did was apply that 600 volts DC to the railway lines, in most cases the third rail. And again, we go back to the third rail, which enabled them to travel, that train to travel at high rates of speed. Why? Because when you're riding along in the third rail, gravity is pushing you down on the third rail, making continuous contact. If you're going with overhead trolley lines, if you've ever seen those, where they're sparking and bouncing, it's bouncing and it's only making intermittent contact with the high voltage wires. So the third rail enabled these trains to reach high rates of speed. So it's very important, and that's why it's called the Great Third Rail. And I would also add that prior to the AE&C building this system with a third rail, nobody had built a system this big using the third rail. They had built a few systems that were a few miles in length, but nobody had built anything on this scale before. So the industry was paying careful attention to what they were doing here. And thereafter, the third rail was adopted by many of the other railways. But prior to that, it was an experiment and an unknown if it would even work. And just again, to emphasize that this was one of the first large-scale electric utility in the western suburbs. So think of the importance of that and how it helped us transition from steam and manual power to electrical power. By 1909, the Batavia power plant was not only powering the AE&C, but three other electric railways, the ones going out to DeKalb, to Belvedere, as well as to Plainfield. So it was powering 4 electric railways at that time. It was generating that much power. It was generating all the power for the city of Elgin. Elgin was a big city. It was generating the power for many of the other communities in the western suburbs. It was generating the power for farmers that lived along the route. They could purchase equipment to enable them for thrashing and milking of cows, etc. So this was space-age stuff to them at that time. And it was used for local industries that were along the railway as well. Again, it was the first large-scale public utility in the western suburbs. So this is the same diagram I showed you a moment ago, just highlighting some of the electrical characteristics of the railway. Here you see the various substations in red, and they were about 5 to 10 miles apart. And the reason for that was because the voltage starts to decay significantly after that. So they spaced these substations strategically a distance apart, and thereby kept the voltage at a fairly constant level throughout the railway. So you see the 6 substations marked out. Here's the powerhouse along the Fox River. And generally speaking, the high voltage lines went along the railway, but in the case of Ingleton, it went overland to substation number 5, as it was called, which was Ingleton, Prince Crossing. The other thing to note about this diagram is there were actually 2 electrical loops. There was a southern loop that went through the Aurora, Batavia, and the main line, and then there was a northern loop that went through Elgin and the main line. And what that resulted in is redundant electrical loops going through the main line. What that meant is that if one of the loops failed for any reason, power would continue to the main line. So they had built-in redundancy to serve their most important traffic going from Chicago to Wheaton. This is the Lombard Station in 1902, shortly after it was built. And there's several interesting aspects of this picture. One is you see the dual trackway, third rail on the interior of those dual trackway. That's one thing. The second thing you see is this large structure called the strain tower. The job of the strain tower was to relieve the strain of the high voltage wires, the high tension wires as they called them, making a right angle turn into the substation. So they went at a 45-degree angle. As you might be able to see from there, they went at a 45-degree angle into the substation. And the wires, it's very faint here, but the wires were draped across, and they came into the wire tower. This was called the wire tower, this cupola. And there's porcelain or ceramic interfaces here, 3 wires. It was 3-phase, 3 wires that brought the wires in, dropped it down to the basement, back up to the main floor where the transformers and rotary converters were located. And then the voltage was applied, brought out and applied to the third rail. Another interesting thing about this is this was an enhanced version, so it had the full awning. It had the passenger waiting area at the end with the little bay there. So that's how you could tell it was an enhanced version of the substation. And the final observation I would make is look at all the windows. There's windows all throughout the building on the first floor and up in the cupola as well. Today, if you go by Clintonville, you go by Prince Crossing, they're all bricked up. But back in the day, they fulfilled a very necessary purpose, which was the dissipation of heat. These machines generated huge amounts of heat, and they had to get rid of that heat. So these were all operable windows. There's an awning style that would flip up. This would open side to side. They'd keep these windows open most of the time and dissipate the heat. So, as I mentioned, they were very interested in speed. That was a key differentiator for them over the steam railway engines. And in 1903, they did a series of time trials. And over the 35 miles from 52nd Avenue to Aurora, they achieved an average speed of over 60 miles an hour and sustained speeds of over 73 miles an hour at various times. And those were world records at the time. And so this train held the world record for electric interurban trains throughout the world for several years thereafter. There was a lot of innovation that went into this railway system. The other thing I would point out about this is they actually achieved much greater speeds. The 60 miles an hour included when they had to slow down for speed limits. The city of Wheaton had a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. They had to slow down when they came into the city limits of Wheaton, 25 miles an hour, until they could speed up again after they got past the city limits. So the 60 miles an hour is a bit of a misnomer. They actually achieved much higher rates of speed. And it was actually designed to, this railway was designed to achieve over 100 miles an hour. But in practice, they never actually went there. But it was not unfamiliar territory for them to achieve 60 to 70 mile an hour speeds at various times. This bit of a thrill ride that they had with these high-speed trains, and just to emphasize how fast this would have been to the people of the last turn of the century, people who were used to horse and buggies, they might have traveled on a steam train that took them 30, 40 miles an hour. Going 67 miles an hour for sustained levels was just mind-boggling to folks. It's like going to some of the trains in Europe and Asia where you're doing 200 or 300 miles an hour, just flying along the ground at that speeds. That's how it was to these folks back then. So a one-way ticket from 52nd Avenue to Aurora was 50 cents, or about $10 in 2020 money, and roughly double that for a return ticket. As a result of all of this, or as a result of their the pushing for speed, for cleanliness, et cetera, this railway was a financial success for the first 10 to 15 years of its existence. It paid dividends back to its capitalist owners in Cleveland and did very well. The ownership remained back in Cleveland, Ohio. They did not deign to move to the Chicago area. And this is probably as good a time as any to talk about safety issues related to these trains. It's easy to wax nostalgic about these trains, but like any railway, they had safety issues. I mean, there was little regulation at the turn of the last century. So there wasn't any sort of automated crossings and so on, and a lot of people got into collisions. Pedestrians, wagons, automobiles, other trains got into collisions with these trains. You have to remember that at the time, people weren't accustomed to the behaviors of this new type of technology, how fast they accelerated, how fast they went, the different audio cues that you got about knowing how far away it was and how quickly it was going to be on top of you. These people had grown up with steam-powered trains, which had different audio cues, so they could tell, well, the train's a few hundred feet away or something of that sort. The electric trains made different noises, different sounds, and it took them a while to get used to that. So at a time when you crossed a railway in a wagon or in an early automobile, you'd creep up to the train and look carefully both ways before deciding if you're going to go over. And sometimes people misjudged. They thought, I can get over, and they couldn't. So they were killed. The other thing I would mention is the electrocutions. Electric railway, a lot of people are curious, well, were there a lot of electrocutions? It's not as easy as people think to be electrocuted by the third rail. You have to be grounded. You have to touch it with bare skin or have to be sopping wet when you touch it. So it wasn't quite as easy as people might think, but a lot of people were electrocuted, mostly employees who were paid effectively the minimum wage, $13, $14 in today's money. Very dangerous work. So people in the powerhouse, section hands, people doing work on the high voltage tension wires overhead. They were frequently killed. Some pedestrians were killed walking on the third rail. Many people were killed, electrocuted when they were in an automobile accident and they were thrown from their vehicle, landed on the third rail with their bare skin, their neck or their arm or something, and that's when they were electrocuted. This is from April 1903. I just put it on here because I thought people might get a kick out of it. But this is the story talking about the record run in the Thunderbolt car from 52nd Avenue to Aurora. And it's fascinating to read this as they go through the various communities. And the reporter is blown away by how fast they're traveling at the rate of speed that they're going. So that was big news back in 1903, that a train can go 60, 70 miles an hour. So as I mentioned, the railway did very well early on. Many stations were added. They started adding freight services. They had added many milk stops for farmers to deliver dairy products to and from the bigger markets in the city. They delivered newspapers, bulk newspapers, to the various towns and cities. They delivered U.S. mail, small packages, small freight for the most part. They added parlor and dining cars, alcohol included. That didn't sit well with places like Wheaton. In 1905, they negotiated a real boon for the company when they negotiated with the Metropolitan West Side elevated tracks to enable them to share the tracks that would take them to the new terminal that was built on Wells Street. And so now this enabled the AE&C trains to go directly from Wheaton all the way into downtown Chicago. Prior to that, people had to get off the train and get onto another train to get to downtown Chicago. But from 1905 onwards, this gave them a huge competitive advantage over a lot of the other railways of going all the way into downtown Chicago. In 1906, they added the Mount Carmel spur. Funeral cars were a big part of their business. This is at a time when a lot of the cemeteries still are. I mean, they were in Forest Park, Hillside, et cetera, where when a loved one died, you would take the casket and one of the funeral cars out to the cemetery, Concordia, et cetera, where the services would be held, and you'd head back at the end of the day. So this was a good business for them, quite frankly. And they added the Mount Carmel Spur to take them a few miles south to the Mount Carmel and Oak Ridge cemeteries, which augmented that business. They also added the Geneva Spur in 1909. So the Geneva Spur was not part of the original design, it came later. And that was 9.5 miles and 12 stations, single trackway, once again. And this spur branched off from the Elgin line. It was called at Geneva Junction. It was also called the Pleasant Hill Junction. It was called Pleasant Hill Junction because it was about 1,000 feet to the west of Pleasant Hill Road, which I think some of you might not be familiar with. And if you look at an aerial photograph today, even today, you see the line of trees and the utility poles still going off from that spot directly south. And it's the vestiges of the Geneva Spur that still exist 80, 90 years later. So this is a map from 1911, and you can see that the Mount Carmel Spur has been added near Bellwood. So right over here. So that's been added. You can also see the Geneva Spur that's been added off of the Elgin line. And the other thing that you'll notice is now the Fox Valley trolley system can take you all the way from Yorkville to the south to Carpentersville to the north. You can also see that from Aurora, you could head out to DeKalb. You could also take the trolley from Elgin out to Belvedere and then to Rockford. So again, this was a very extensive railway system that used to exist in the 1910, 1911 timeframe. This is 1910 Advertisement, and I just thought it was interesting because it shows a few things that they were going after for business. They had a drop off in weekend business, so they pushed the excursion business. They had an excursion park in Glenwood by the power plant, although I've always wondered how it was going out to the country next to a big power plant billowing smoke coming out. But in any event, one of the things that they promoted heavily was taking the weekend excursion. And you could do that because these trains were fast. They would take you from Chicago out to the Fox River Valley in an hour or less. So you could get out there in the morning, spend the entire day out there, and come back in the evening. So they heavily promoted this notion of the weekend excursions out to the Fox River Valley, where you could pick daisies with your loved one. The other thing to notice here is that they're still pushing the Great Third Rail electric line. So electric technology is still very important and still seen as a differentiator for them. We mentioned that the headquarters of the CA&E, AE&C was in Wheaton, and it did indeed start in Wheaton. And they built a 3 or 4 story building on the southeast corner of Liberty and Main. Very nice building. It had a hip roof, and it had a walkway at the top, sort of a porch area at the very top. And at the very peak of this hip roof was a large pole. I'm not sure if it was metal or wood. But I think they thought they were protected from lightning strikes via the DuPage County Courthouse, which was just a short distance away, and they thought, well, it's much taller, that will get hit before we do. Well, they were wrong. There was a freak storm that came through in March of 1913 that a lightning bolt struck this building and burned it down to the ground in a very short period of time. The newspapers blamed it on the lack of firefighting infrastructure and water pressure in Wheaton, but in any case, it went down very fast. And when people sometimes wonder about the lack of records on the early history of the AE&C and the CA&E, it's because a lot of them were lost in this fire. So whatever they could salvage, they did, and they brought it kitty corner across the street to the northwest corner of Liberty and Main, where the train station was located. They had just built it in 1911. Very nice station. We'll talk about it momentarily. but they took over one of the office spaces and were all crammed into this very small area within the Wheaton station for about a year and a half. And they finally moved out to Aurora, and they took over the 5th and 6th floor of one of the skyscrapers in Aurora, Hotel Arthur. It's still there today. Joyce will talk about that. Very nice building. But they took over the 5th and 6th floor as the headquarters, the administrative offices, and on the first floor was the terminal. So it was street boarding. You'd go out to the middle of Broadway there. This was at the northwest corner of Galena and Broadway. You'd go out to Broadway and board the trolley, the train out in the middle of the street. And there were 2 or 3 other trolley lines that had a terminal on that first floor, the ones going out to DeKalb, to Yorkville, and so on. So this building became known as the Traction Terminal Building. Traction's another word for trolley, but that's how it got its name. About this time, World War I started, 1916, 1917, and in the late 1910s, the railway was suffering financially. And one of the reasons why they were suffering financially was because of regulatory fare limits. They had spent a lot of money in the buildup of the railway, adding new stations, adding new lines and spurs and so on. But they really couldn't charge more to customers as a result of that because of regulations. So they began losing money as a result. And in 1919, there was a general strike by the A&C employees, and shortly after that, they filed for bankruptcy. Before we go on to the next chapter of what happened with the A&C after 1919, we're just going to talk a little bit about the stations, because we think, Joyce and I tend to think that the stations are very interesting. It's what the people experienced every day. Everybody knew where the train station was in their locality and in their community. There were approximately 70 stations in the railway network, and they varied from being very humble shacks, basically, to very well-architected, beautifully built buildings, brick and stone, that existed. So they varied dramatically. And they also varied over time. When we tend to talk about the Wheaton station, for instance, the Wheaton station that we'll show you a picture of, that wasn't what the original station looked like. The original station was made of wood. The subsequent one was made of brick. And that's true of almost every station in the system, with the exception of the electric substations, Clintonville, and so on. So the thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about the stations of the CA&E is they changed over time. And what you might see a picture of in 1950 might not be what it looked like in 1930 or 1920. It's just something to keep in mind. The design of these buildings was varied, and sometimes it was dictated by the local government. So, for instance, Wheaton mandated a Elizabethan aesthetic for their building design, and so the A&C complied with that. Another example is the Ardmore Station in Villa Park, which I think many of you might have seen already, but that was built by the developers who were selling the Ardmore subdivision. And they wanted a very nice place for prospective buyers to disembark, so they built this very nice station for them to do that back in 1911. Most of these stations were flag stops, also called whistle stops, also called halts. But basically, passengers would pull a chain to raise a metal or wooden flag, which indicated to the conductor or engineer to come to a stop. There were passengers waiting. If that flag was down, the train kept going. That's the way most of it worked most of the time. And you can see one of those flags here. This is a Green Valley station in Lombard. You can see it's a shed roof shack, basically. This is Stewart Avenue, also in Lombard. This is about 8 by 8 foot wooden structure. And this is the Chicago Golf Club. Very nice building, built around 1910. I think many of you have passed by this along the Aurora line, where there's a bend in the pathway there. And there's a bench there, I think, today. That's where the Chicago Golf Club facility used to be. And this design, in fact, was quite popular. The same exact design with bricks and clay tile roof. You'd also see that in Elmhurst, in Berkeley. You also saw it in High Lake along the Geneva line. So this particular station design was seen at many places in the railway system. Here's a few more examples. This is a unique example. This is at Collingbourne in South Elgin. It's stucco or concrete, I'm not sure which, and it's either hexagonal or octagonal, I'm not sure which. And this same station was also at the Geneva Road station, which was by County Farm and Geneva. So it's the exact same station that they had there as well. Where they came up with that and why, I have no idea. But it's a unique design. Here's the Villa Park station, back when it was originally built in 1929. And that's certainly a beautiful station that still exists today. Here's the Ardmore station, built in 1911. Again, with the clay tile roof, very elegant design. And then there's the Glen Ellen station, which is a cottage-style stone building, very beautifully architected, built in 1926. The thing about this picture is, that's very interesting, is this is shortly after the new station was built, and you can still see the old station here. So this dramatically illustrates how the station's changed over time. This is a very modest wooden gable-ended roof, roof. Much more modest station than what came right after it in 1926. And then, of course, there's Wheaton. So this was the station that was in the center of Wheaton from 1911 onwards. Prior to this, there was a larger wooden station, but it wasn't nearly as nice as this. This is red brick with a clay tile roof, Elizabethan aesthetic. It had an elegant staircase that approached from the south. This is looking towards the northwest, and this other photograph is looking towards the southwest. There was another station on this side of the tracks because along the main line there was always a station on both sides of the dual trackway, the eastbound station and the westbound station. The eastbound station was always much nicer than the westbound station. So this is, by the way, when that fire occurred in 1913, this is the building that they crammed themselves into. This is a large building. It was 100 feet long by 30 feet wide. It had heated waiting room, it had a luggage area, it had public toilets, it had a few offices. This is a very nice, well-appointed building, but it should have been. This was the hub of the entire railway. But this is the building that they crammed themselves into for a year and a half for the administrative center. So back to the AE&C. When we last left it, it had just declared bankruptcy in 1919. Excuse me. In 1922, it was purchased by a few investors, R.M. Stinson and Dr. Thomas Conway. Stinson had a bad horse riding accident and was killed in 1922, so Conway pretty much ran the show thereafter. The Fox Valley Trolley System was split off at about this time, so it was no longer part of the Third Rail Division any longer, and it was off on its own at this point. They reorganized the AE&C as the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railway. Not a big difference, but it was different. And they did set about a modernization program, and so they reballasted the entire grading of along the right-of-way. In other words, they put new stone in and re-leveled it. It had deteriorated somewhat over the 20 years since they had first built the railway, and that deterioration caused a lot of service problems. The trackway wasn't nearly as smooth, et cetera, so this reballasting fixed all of those problems. They also added in several automated substations. Remember the 6 substations they started with? These were additional substations to help regulate and stabilize the voltage along the lines. They added automated substations in Wheaton, Bellwood, Warrenville, and a few other locations. And perhaps the biggest change they made was they upgraded the cars that passengers rode in. They went from wood cars to steel cars at that time. So passengers saw this as a major improvement. About this time, Sam Insall, the fellow to the right, took over in 1926. And he also set about some infrastructure and safety improvements. This is when you started to see more automated railway crossings and so on. But Insull was a very interesting character. I think many folks in the audience might know about him already, but I'll tell the story nonetheless. He was a London-born industrialist who came to the US at an early age. He worked at one of the first utilities, Edison Electric. He came to the Chicago area in the early 1890s, and he started an electric utility company, one of the first in the area. And over the course of a few decades, he accumulated a vast empire of public utility companies and railways. And the acquisition of the CA&E was another acquisition in the portfolio of this empire. He built some new stations. You know, we talk about the Glen Ellen Station, 1926. We talk about the Villa Park Station, 1929. The Poplar Avenue Station in Elmhurst. These were all built under his tenure. And perhaps the most important thing that he did was, remember I said he owned public utilities and railways. He saw those as two separate businesses. He didn't see any reason why the CA&E should be generating its own power. And the electric utilities had started to mature by this point. So he formally separated the power generation distribution part of the company from the railway part of the company. And one of the things we still have with us today, if you've ever walked along the Prairie Path, and you always see the utility poles and the substations along the Prairie Path, well, that's because the railway went away, but the rights to the usage of that land was still owned by the Insull's power companies, Commonwealth Edison. It became Commonwealth Edison. So Commonwealth Edison still owns the rights to string their lines, to have substations right along that right of way. So that's a bit of a legacy we've come down the years through with. The railway went away, but since he split it off from the railway, the power company still owns the rights to access that right of way. They also added the Westchester Spur in 1926. And the original idea for the Westchester Spur was they had grand visions for it. It was going to go a few miles to the south near Bellwood, and then it was going to loop all the way around towards Aurora. So they'd have another train line heading out to Aurora through the southwest suburbs. But unfortunately, that never happened because something got in the way. I'll talk about that in a moment. This is a few advertisements from the late 1920s that might be interesting, but this left-hand advertisement emphasizes the fact that Insull separated the power distribution from the railways itself. The Public Service Company of Northern Illinois, which is today Commonwealth Edison, furnishes the power for a fast suburban service. So the idea is that we supply the power for this very fast interurban train, and it's two separate entities, no longer coupled together like it had been in the early days. To the right, again, we see another advertisement for the CA&E at the time, and you can see that they're still advertising high-speed electrically operated trains. Those were still the number one differentiators for them, high-speed electrically operated. So this is a 1934 map of the line, and you can still see the Westchester Spur, a couple miles coming down from Bellwood, and the Mount Carmel Spur is still in existence. The Fox Valley lines, however, have pretty much disappeared at this point. Remember I said they split off in 1922 and they were on their own. Ridership had been falling off steadily, and by the 1930s, the Fox Valley lines were gone. So the thing that got in the way of the Westchester Spur was the Depression. 1929, the Depression hit. CA&E ridership, which was on the decline at that time, declined precipitously during this period, the early 1930s through the late 1930s. And Sam Insull resigned from the CNA Board of Directors at this point. And within a month later, the CA&E went into receivership. Insull's companies and his empire was highly leveraged. And as a result of that, his investors lost their life savings. And this was the time when people were jumping out of buildings, et cetera, as a result of losing their life savings, when a lot of these stocks that they held became absolutely worthless. And Insull's empire became absolutely worthless during this time period. He fled the country, fearing legal retribution. He went to Paris first, then he went to Greece. He was extradited in 1934. He was fully tried and acquitted, so he was found not guilty. And he found his way back to Paris, and in 1938 he died on a Paris metro station platform of a heart attack, penniless. So it just, I guess there's a lesson there somewhere, but intriguing story. So the CA&E once again enters receivership. And in 1934, the Mount Carmel branch ended service. The funeral service business had been dying off, so to speak. So I just thought of that joke, by the way. So they ended service for the Mount Carmel branch in 1934. By the mid-1930s, the Fox Valley lines were shut down as well. The Geneva Spur was abandoned in 1937. So it lasted, 38 years from 1909 to 1937. And then World War II came along. This is a map, 1946. And a few things to note from this particular diagram. First, the line still goes all the way into the Wells Street station in Chicago. So they still have the ability to go all the way from Wheaton into Chicago at this point. The Geneva line is now gone. They've replaced it with motor coach bus service from St. Charles to the Lakewood station. Lakewood station was located by 59 and North Avenue. So if you look to your right as you're heading to Menards, is where the Lakewood station used to exist, down below on the right side of the road. And note that the Westchester line is still operational at this point. Now, the final act came between 1942 and 1961. Believe it or not, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, ridership and revenues were actually up. Things were actually looking good for the company. They finally came out of receivership in 1946. So the overall attitude in the company was much more optimistic. In 1951, they shut down the Westchester service more as a cost-cutting move. They found
Your time's up. I'm kidding.
I believed you for a minute. But in any case, they shut down the Westchester service because the ridership never really took off along that line to begin with, and they decided to cut out some of the less producing parts of the railway. But the real death knell came for the railway in 1953, and that's when they started to build the Congress Expressway, today the Eisenhower Expressway. The right-of-way for the expressway, unfortunately, was going to go through a portion of the former right-of-way of the CA&E and the elevated lines. Remember the Metropolitan West elevated lines? That had been taken over by the CTA for the Garfield line some years previously. So the Congress Expressway needed that real estate, and they were going to tear down part of the Garfield line as a result. And there was a lot of back and forth between the CA&E, the City of Chicago, the CTA, et cetera, trying to negotiate a long-term solution. The initial idea was that this was going to be temporary. They were going to be moved off the right-of-way just temporarily. But in the end, it turned out that they couldn't come to an agreement, and Forest Park became the east terminal for the CA&E. This was of great dissatisfaction to most of their riders, who now had to get off the train, Forest Park, get on a CTA train to make the rest of the ride into Chicago. But this was a double whammy, because when they opened the Congress Expressway, now you've opened up an avenue for all of the car traffic, automobile traffic coming in from the west suburbs into downtown Chicago. So not only did you make the ride to Chicago less convenient with putting the terminal at Forest Park, but now you've put this big highway that goes from the western suburbs into the heart of Chicago. So a lot of the people that formerly were riding the train started to drive their car. And as a result, they lost about 50% of their ridership in the early 1950s. And you can imagine this was a huge toll on the company. This picture is showing Mayor Daley and other dignitaries cutting the ribbon for the Congress Expressway but it could equally be them cutting the revenues for the CA&E. They were hemorrhaging money at this point, literally hemorrhaging money, and they couldn't pay their bills. So unexpectedly, around midday on July 3rd, 1957, they shut down all passenger traffic, much to the consternation of tens of thousands of passengers who had ridden it in the morning and had no way to get home at night. So they had to have some emergency bus service, take people back over the course of that evening back to the western suburbs to their homes. You can imagine that this made a lot of people very angry as a result. The CA&E hung on for a few more years, just doing freight service. It was no longer doing passenger service. It hung on, but I think people knew that the writing was on the wall. And in 1961, they formally abandoned the right-of-way. And the state of Illinois took over the right-of-way. They deeded it to the various counties, DuPage, Kane, Cook County, wherever the railway had been. And some of the right-of-way was indeed sold off to private parties after that, unfortunately. This just shows a fairly famous photograph showing one of the last trains, if not the last train, heading out of Forest Park at noon that day on July 3rd. The conductor waving goodbye. And next to it is a newspaper article describing the great inconvenience and chaos that it caused for many of the commuters that were stranded downtown that day. So what is the CA&E legacy? Well, they started out to connect the communities. They saw an opportunity, some Cleveland capitalists saw an opportunity at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries to connect communities between the population centers of Chicago and the Fox River Valley. And indeed, they achieved that mission. They provided rapid travel for passengers and freight between Chicago and the Fox River Valley and all the communities in between. It accelerated and shaped the western suburbs. I think the western suburbs would look very different today if it weren't for the CA&E Railway. I'm not saying it would be worse or better. I'm just saying it would look very different from if we did not have the CA&E as part of our heritage. It literally shaped the land, the topography of the land. It changed landscapes, it changed the path of roads, as Joyce mentioned earlier, other parts of the railway. And it did that through all of Cook County, DuPage County, and Kane County. So I guess the biggest legacy of all was the Illinois Prairie Path. And I think everybody here knows the story about in 1963, after it had been abandoned for a few years, the naturalist from the Morton Arboretum, Mayfield Watts, proposed in a Chicago Tribune letter that they convert the abandoned right-of-way to a nature trail. It would be the first rails-to-trails conversion in the United States. And it involved the tireless work of many of the IPP founders, working with officials of DuPage County initially, later with Cook County and Kane County. But it took a lot of work to get that to happen. And remember I said the state of Illinois deeded that property to the counties. So counties like DuPage County, for the most part, turned that over to the Illinois Prairie Path, or for the use of the Illinois Prairie Path. There was some sell-off of property, I can't explain why, but there was some sell-off of property to private individuals and to institutions. The good news is that over 86% of the right-of-way was preserved, and that's including the right-of-way that goes into 52nd Avenue by Laramie in Chicago. If you go to Forest Park, the percentage goes up probably to about 90% or more. So the good news is they preserved the vast majority of the right-of-way of the former CA&E. And I think anybody who uses the Illinois Prairie Path realizes that it continues to connect the communities. It continues to allow people to, in a much more relaxed mode, walking, riding their bike, horseback riding, to travel from community to community and to see those towns, those cities in ways that you cannot see from the road. So I think it's still fulfilling its mission for connecting those communities. And I just wanted to put up this trail map of the Illinois Prairie Path because does this look familiar at all? We've shown you many maps through the years of the CA&E Railway, and this directly mirrors, exactly mirrors the CA&E Railway. There's only a few changes to it. They've added in the Great Western Trail here, but aside from that, you still have the Geneva Spur, you still have the Batavia Spur. They've added in this, but the Aurora branch, the Elgin branch, and the Fox River line is still all there. So when we think about the Illinois Prairie Path, I think we have to owe some gratitude to some of the capitalists in Cleveland who envisioned a high-speed rail system in the Chicago area more than 100 years ago. So the next part of the talk is going to be talking about how you can still find pieces of the CA&E yourself today and what's left along the Illinois Prairie Path. And Joyce is going to lead us in that discussion. Do you want me to put this back?
Yeah, put it there. Want your glasses? He's much more experienced at this than I am. I'm staying put here. And I have to figure out it. So, as Brian mentioned, when the Illinois Prairie Path took over the right-of-way for the CA&E, and when the CA&E closed, the company was in receivership. So there was very little money for them, actually virtually none, to clean up the right-of-way. Some of the rails were sold for salvage to pay off the debtors, but that left the stations, bridges, underpasses, the signals, flag stops, all of that was just left where it was standing. Some of that is long gone, but there's actually quite a bit still along the Prairie Path. We were mentioning to people that were arriving early that when we were younger, like Brian said, we were in Villa Park, not far from the Prairie Path, for almost 10 years. We've been here for about 27 years. We'd be along the path or with our kids, and you see these cement things. And I remember thinking when our kids were young, I was like, oh, did they have lights along here? That's too bad. Why didn't they put them back in? Well, that was from the CA&E. We actually have found over 80 artifacts just along the Elgin Branch, and that's not bridges and underpasses. That is, the small signal bases. The Elgin Branch of the 5 branches seems to kind of have the most of those small cement artifacts left. The Geneva Branch actually has the least, but that's because the Geneva Spur closed when the CA&E still was operating, and they had the money to clean it up. And they did clean it up. These are some of the signal bases and light bases that I was talking about. Most of these pictures were taken probably later spring and early summer because you can see the vegetation starting to grow. By about this time, not too much longer, a lot of these bases get covered with the vegetation, and you can think you know where they are, and you're walking along and it's like, where is that? Some of them too are, they're further away from the path, and so again, when the vegetation is out, you don't stand a chance of it, unless you want to risk poison ivy and go tromping off looking for them. Many of these bases are still standing in situ where they were when the CA&E was operating. Some obviously are a little worse for the wear, and some are no longer standing, either from nature or assistance. These photographs we found, actually, it's, again, as I said, it's really the easiest time to find these are late fall, winter, if there's not too much snow, and early spring, when the vegetation has died back. This is an example of a signal base. They generally had a hole in the center of the cement base, and you can kind of see the insulation around it for the wires to go through. As we mentioned, there's still many bridges and underpasses in existence and in use that were built for the CA&E. This was what they called, when it was first built, this was Tall Bridge. Now we call this Volunteer Bridge. The Chicago Northwestern tracks are under here, Wesley Street here, single CA&E cars crossing over the bridge. This is Wesley Street Station and the steps leading down to Wesley Street. Currently, as Volunteer Bridge, the platform or decking of this bridge has been raised by several feet just to conform to the elevation of the pathway. This is a cement bridge in Lincoln Marsh area that's going over the west branch of the DuPage River. Both of these bridges are along the Elgin line. This is another small bridge over Winfield Creek, again in the Lincoln Marsh area. This is a bridge over Poplar Creek in Elgin Township, pretty close to the Fox River, of course in Elgin there. This is a small bridge or culvert in Aurora. It's a few hundred feet east of Farnsworth Road, and that was along the Aurora branch. This here are the cement piers. It's all that remains of the bridge over the west branch of the DuPage River in Winfield, and that was on the Geneva Spur. If you've taken the Geneva path and you go down that little, it seems like dead end towards, it says the Winfield Mounds, and you keep going straight instead of turning off for Winfield Mounds, then you end up right here. This is the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy underpass, close to Route 25 in Batavia, on the Batavia Spur. And this is the Indiana Harbor Belt interchange in Bellwood, Illinois. This was built in the 1930s when the Indiana Harbor Belt interchange was significantly enhanced. This is the Chicago Northwestern underpass on the northwest side of, a little bit past Raymond Street, again close to the Fox River in Elgin, Illinois. This is an Art Deco pilaster that remains from the Wolf Road Bridge in Hillside, Illinois, and that was on the main line. There's 7 stations and 1 administrative building that are still standing from the CA&E times. This is the latest Villa Park station. The first station was a small wooden building and platform at Stecker Road. As Brian mentioned, it was replaced in 1910 with the traditional brick and clay tile station, and this Tudor Revival station was built in 1929. Now, the Village of Villa Park helped to save this building from the wrecking ball. They bought it in 1976, and it's been the home of the Villa Park Historical Museum since that time. The Ardmore Station, as Brian had mentioned too, was built in 1911. It was funded by the land developers for the Ardmore subdivision. Ardmore itself, that subdivision, has since been incorporated into Villa Park, and this station was again saved by the Village of Villa Park, who bought it in 1976, and this serves as the Villa Park Chamber of Commerce building. This is the Clintonville station or substation. It was also known as substation number 6, and it's, as we've mentioned, it's in South Elgin. Some of the windows and doors, many of them have been bricked up, but otherwise the architecture remains true to the original build. The land here is owned by the Kane County Forest Preserve, but the Valley Model Railroad Association occupies the building and maintains the grounds. They have a website, vmrr.org, and it gives their hours. They are very open and welcoming. They love giving tours of their building. So if you want to see the inside sometime, look up when they're open and go pay them a visit. The grounds, we personally have found this is a really nice area to picnic. And I know the VMRA is working with the Illinois Prairie Path Association to try to put in a few more picnic tables and benches and so give people more places to sit when you're there. This is the Prince Crossing or Ingleton substation. And this station and the Clintonville station were built in 1902. They and the Aurora substation had identical builds when they were first built in the 1920s and 30s, I believe, or was it the 10s and 20s?
The original bill was 1902, but the additions were 1910s.
1920s, yes. The additions were put onto the Prince Crossing substation. When the CA&E closed, the Prince Crossing substation was home to an architectural design firm and other businesses. It's currently owned by Wheaton Academy, and this is the substation some of you may have heard that is in danger of being demolished right now. Wheaton Academy has applied for a permit to do that. It's still up in the air on if it's going to be approved or not, which would be a shame, as these substations, there's not that many of them. The building, they had unique building designs and specifications, and they were the first electric utility in the area in the early part of the 20th century. So,
And that's the only one in DuPage County?
yeah, because this is in Kane County. And they're the only two substations still standing. Both of these terminals, the Geneva terminal and the Batavia terminal, went into buildings that were already standing at the time those two lines were opened. The Geneva terminal went into a storefront on the west side of the Fox River along Route 38, the north side of the street. Since the building was not purpose-built for the CA&E, it managed to stay in existence and in use even after the Geneva Spur was closed, and it's currently the home of the Nobel House restaurant. The Batavia terminal likewise went into a building that was already in existence. This was the Tomley building. It was built by Norwegian immigrants to house their furniture building. The lowest floor of the building served as the ticket office and a small waiting area for the CA&E, with trains coming and leaving from the rear of the building and heading south towards Aurora. As Brian's mentioned, this is the traction terminal building in Aurora. It is still standing on the northwest corner of Broadway and Galena. The CA&E office, the headquarters, while they were out in Aurora, occupied the 5th and 6th floors. The ticket office was on the 1st floor. This was built, actually, another building that was not purpose-built for CA&E. It was built in 1905 as Hotel Arthur. And for many years, it was the tallest building in Aurora. Other artifacts that can be found along the Prairie Path today, these are the steps that had led up to the High Lake Station along the Geneva line. They're about 1,000 feet east of High Lake Road in West Chicago. The High Lake Station itself was a brick building with a clay tile roof, similar in design to the Berkeley and Elmhurst stations. Here, this is the curb, and there are still actually cinders from the cinder platform. This is the Church Road station, which, not surprisingly, is on Church Road in Aurora. Now, Brian and I actually just drove past here last week. We weren't able to stop, but there was a significant amount of construction going on there. So we can't actually say if the curb and the platform are still there. The cinders that were there, and you can occasionally find some of the cinders at some of the other stations too, they were the residue from the coal-powered boiler furnaces at the Batavia Powerhouse. So as Brian mentioned, Wheaton was the hub and for many years the headquarters of the CA&E. As such, a large part of the downtown area, especially from south of Liberty Drive and west of West Street, comprising almost 25 acres. And that was the CA&E railways, rail yards, and offices and other outbuildings. Wheaton itself had 10 different stations, way more than any other community on the lines. But we also had 3 lines coming through us. There were actually 2 dispatch towers. The new one was just south of Liberty Drive, and the older one was just beyond that. They have both been demolished, as have all of the stations from Wheaton. The rail yard and the maintenance shops, which were in this downtown area, they're long gone. And there were 2 automated substations that are gone. The administrative building, the last one that was built in the 1940s, that is still in existence and in use on the southwest corner of West and Liberty. And there's still a couple buildings on the west side of Carlton Street. So this is an aerial photograph from the mid-1950s when the CA&E was still in operation. So this is where the main line is coming in from Chicago. The headquarters buildings would be off to the right here. This is the Elgin line heading off to the north. You can see Tall Bridge there over the Chicago Northwestern tracks. The Aurora line is coming off to the left here. This area here is now Carlton Street. And this is the Wallfill building. And this is the other, there's office buildings. I'm blanking on the street number right now. This is the maintenance shop for the railway. Okay, here is the new dispatch tower. And where did my dot go? Oh, this is the original dispatch tower. So the maintenance shops were in the heart of the rail yard. They were originally built with 7 large bays to repair and maintain the trains. Over the course of the lifetime of the CA&E, 3 additional bays were added on, so obviously there were 10 in total. This was located where the 3 Wheaton Center apartments are right now. This is what they call the new dispatch tower, which had clear line of sight on the 2nd floor for all 3 lines, the main line coming in and the Elgin and Aurora going off. This was located along Liberty Street, about 500 feet west of West Street, towards the south side of Liberty. This is one of the 2 automated substations that were added in the 1920s and the 1930s. One was along Child Street, and the other was along Liberty Drive. This is the recent, newest, the latest CA&E administrative building. It's at the southwest corner of Liberty and West Street, and is still in existence today. When it was built, there was CA&E lettering above both of the porticos on the north side of the street. The lettering's long gone, but if you stand there and look up, you can still see the holes where the supports were for the letters. And then this is the Wallfill building on the northwest corner of Child Street and Carlton Street. It's hard to see here, but there are still remnants of track in the gravel outside there. Now, I did notice recently that they have put in wood privacy fencing here. So I'm not positive if it's on this side too. If it is, you're only going to be able to see them if they have the gates open. Here, this is the 303 Carlton Street. This is the building that is here. It bends off to the west, which today looks really strange, but in this picture you can see it was built to conform to a rail line that went past it to the north. So, as we've mentioned, the best time to look for at least the smaller artifacts, the bridges and stations, obviously you could see whenever, is try looking for that in the late autumn and early spring. You would want to look on both sides of the track, up to even 30 feet away from the track. A lot of the track is still where it was for the CA&E right-of-way, but in some instances it has changed. And if you're not really sure, watch the telephone lines. If the utility lines are far off, you're probably in an area where it has switched. If there were streets, stations, crossings there, that's where you're going to find more of the concrete artifacts. And again, if the path is now changed, they're going to be further away from there. That's why you might get into that 30 feet line. Also, if you find one, look on the opposite side of the track. There's frequently pairs on both sides. And again, they cluster near where there was a crossing, a road, railway, a station. When we have taken pictures of it, we'll typically turn the GPS locator on our phone and then take a picture, because especially if you're there in the spring or fall, you'll say, oh, I'll find this again. And if you go in July, you're not finding it. So if you would like to learn more about the CA&E, you can look at our Be Historic website. We have a video series on the CA&E. There's 3 videos on the Clintonville substation that really goes in depth for its structure and how the whole electrical system worked with the CA&E. There's videos on, as Nancy has mentioned, we have a couple on tragedies. So far we've just done the Elgin and the Geneva line, but not all of, but a few of the accidents that occurred for there. Another one on the architect for the CA&E. And there will probably be more coming in the future. There's also a lot of good websites. The GreatThirdRail.org, the TrolleyDodger.com is a good site. 2 Facebook groups are pretty active regarding the CA&E, Stations of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin, and the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin, the Aurora and Elgin. The books, there's The Great Third Rail by the Central Electric Rail Fans Association, and The Story of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railroad by Larry Plankno. There's also a current periodical called The First and Fastest that's published by the Shoreline Organization. So now, if you have any questions, we will try to do it. We won't do questions. Your voice carries better.
So questions? Yes, sir.
There used to be a train stop by the Midwest Military Academy, but I know there's several stations. It's like the Golf Club, the Wheaton, which wasn't there also one just for the academy?
You know, the question was, wasn't there another station by the, for the Midwest Military Academy, which is right near Plamondon, Orchard Avenue, and so on, right where the railway split off. And we looked for that, but we couldn't find any evidence for that. Now, it's possible that it did exist, but all we could find in our research was Plamondon, and then the Chicago Gulf a little bit further to the, but we've read about that too. People have made allusions to that, but we could never find any actual evidence. And we tend to think that people were referring to the Plamondon station for that station, because it was just a short distance away from where, literally perhaps a couple hundred feet.
Bob Goldberg gave a talk here on famous fires buildings. He had a picture of this station for the academy.
Okay. Well, I think somebody mentioned that that's on YouTube, so there was a few other pictures we were interested in seeing from that talk as well, so we might look at that. But it might still be Plamondon. Yeah, so, no, that's a very good question. Let's see, take her. Yeah.
When did they tear down the big Wheaton station?
I believe in the late 1960s. It was for a few years after. The question was, when did they tear down the Wheaton station? It was used as the Democratic headquarters in DuPage County because it was close to the county courthouse for a handful of years. I don't think terribly long. But as far as we can tell, it was torn down in the late 1960s, 1970 timeframe.
It also had an antique store in it, because as a child we went in and they had a casket, and kids thought that was the neatest thing to see that.
Do you know about what time frame that was?
I moved here in '53, so probably early '60s.
Okay. Yeah, so we believe it was the late 60s. Yeah.
Is the reason they reconfigured by that one substation in DuPage County on Prince Crossing, is that because of the school taking ownership?
Oh, you mean the path no longer?
Yeah, where they cut it off. It used to go right next to the station, and now it's moved.
So the question is, there's been a reconfiguration in the Illinois Prairie Path whereby you can no longer go through the Ingleton Prince Crossing station. You have to go to the Great Western Trail and then go about 300 feet and marry up again with the Illinois Prairie Path beyond that to the west. Good question. We don't know. That land was sold, I think, about 20, 25 years ago to Wheaton Academy. Why it was sold, under what conditions, we don't know. But well, I don't mean to suggest anything by that. But I do question why was any sections of the Illinois Prairie Path sold off, and what was it about that particular piece of property that allowed it to be sold off? We don't know. We are looking into that now, by the way, because we are in discussions with the Illinois Prairie Path as well as the DuPage County Forest Preserve, if there's a way to preserve that before it gets demolished. So those are all very good questions, but we don't know the answer.
I
John?
think it got changed to make it safer instead of having two trails.
Yeah, good point, good point.
That, and
I ride a lot.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I agree with that. And also, as you're coming down Prince Crossing Street towards it, you're coming down a hill and crossing there, and then you have another hill coming down. I wonder too if it wasn't safety, because if cars are coming pretty fast, you could be in the middle of the street and the car's there, and you're the loser if you're on a bike.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so that actually answered the question better, which is that for safety purposes, because of that hill, they probably rerouted it to the Great Western. Yeah. Yes?
Are some of the cars preserved today somewhere?
Yeah, I think at the Illinois Railway Museum, so the question was, are any of the cars preserved? I think at the Illinois
They got about 10 of them up at the Illinois Railway Museum.
yeah, and that's in Union, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't
So-
one still running right along the farmers, there's one that runs right along the prairie path? The railroad?
Oh, the trolley, yeah, the Fox River Trolley Museum.
Right.
Yeah, they also have a few stations there, like the Wayne Station, and there's at least one other there, a smaller wooden station, and they have some trains there as well. Yeah, so those are two great places to visit if you're interested in the CAE.
Because I know some people have mentioned about with the Prince Crossing Station trying to move it, but that one being such a large brick building is be incredibly expensive to do. So we're hoping, I don't know, the suggestions are made, try to make a land swap and see if maybe the IPP or the Forest Preserve can swap with Wheaton Academy to maintain it. Because the Forest Preserve has land on 3 sides of that. don't
Two
they?
sides,
Two
yeah.
sides of it. So they're trying.
So, this gentleman, yes.
Did the railroad go underneath the Chicago Great Western?
Yes, yeah, so the CA&E went through an underpass under the Chicago Great Western. So that ridge is still there for the Chicago Great Western. I mean, it dips down a little bit, but the ridge that the Great Western went on is still in existence if you go there.
And the
I think that I remember riding there back in the 70s on the north side, and you had to actually climb up and over the right-of-way of the Chicago Great Western to continue on.
Oh,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
they've smoothed it out a little bit now.
Yeah, I mean, it still is a pretty steep incline coming up for the Prairie Path to the Chicago Great Western Trail, but yeah, because what we did in the tragedies thing, that there was a couple deaths there.
You know, back in the day, you actually had to climb up the
Right,
right-of-way.
yeah, exactly. Other questions? This gentleman here.
You mentioned that each car had their own power system.
Mhm.
Did each car have an operator or an engineer?
No, I think the lead car was where the operator, the engineer was, but they could all contribute to the impetus of the train. You know what I'm saying? So all the motors could help propel the train forward, but it was controlled by the lead
Full
car.
house, you still have full power.
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, so that was very interesting aspect of the.
Take 1 or 2 more questions, Barry's wanting
Okay.
to stop.
Okay. A few more questions, and I guess we're getting kicked out. This woman here.
Was there a whistle stop along Roosevelt Road?
Yes.
Yeah.
The short
where-
answer is
where
yes.
Carlton Avenue is, because I remember seeing as a young child, my dad getting on the train there.
Yeah, so the question was there a whistle stop by Roosevelt Road? And it was called Chicago Avenue at that time. And so it was, the train station there was called Emory at Chicago, because there was a separate Emory station just a little further south. They were just a short distance from one another, but the one by Roosevelt Road was called Emory at Chicago. It was a nice little station.
But anyway.
Yeah. That gentleman in the back who's been waiting patiently.
I lived in Villa Park in 53 and 54 and rode the train, but I don't remember a third rail.
Oh, you don't remember a third rail?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was in Foxborough.
And that was on the CA&E?
Yeah.
Well, I think it was there.
I thought it was battery operated.
You had a picture of the dual tracks, showed only 2 rails per traffic on that station.
From Villa Park?
Yeah, the picture you showed.
Unless there was overhead trolley wires at that location, but we'd have to go study the photograph.
So last question to the gentleman at the back by the chair.
By the,
How this rail work, CA&E work with what we have currently for the Metro rail. So would there have been 4 independent tracks, because they were parallel with each other, if it was currently along where the Illinois Ferry Path is now, or like for like downtown Wheaton, how would that have looked when all of these rails were running?
yeah, so for on the main line, there would have been the 4 parallel tracks plus the 2/3 rails that would have been on the inside, furthest away from the passenger stations, if you will. So they would have been just to the outside of the outer, the inner rails, you know what I'm saying? So there would have been 6 rails going along in parallel with one another.
And that's how Wheaton would have looked?
That's how Wheaton would have looked, yeah. Yeah, and there was in some urban areas, they did switch over to the overhead trolley wires, and maybe Villa Park was. I didn't think it was, but maybe it was when you bring that up. But they did that for a variety of reasons, and but it did slow the trains down quite a bit.
So we should close.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.